Yinka, is the third party note, is that from you? That popped up? Let's authorize it.
I saw the YouTube stream go live too.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. We have a few people in the waiting room. We will probably start at 6:35 just to allow everyone that is still entering to enter, and then we can all start together. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kieta Holmes, and I am the Director of the Office of Zoning and Development. I'd like to welcome you here this evening for a discussion on Module 2 site development. I hope that you all had a wonderful holiday season and were able to survive the snow without relatively any type of damage to your persons, your properties, or yourself. This evening, we will have a discussion on Module 2, site development, and we'll answer all of your questions as thoroughly and completely as possible. We would ask that any question that you ask tonight or any commentary that you provide be done so civilly and that you do not offend anyone or disparage anyone's name. We'd like to thank you again for coming, and at this time, I'll turn it over to our project manager, Mr. Caleb Russico.
Thank you very much, Director Holmes, and good evening, everyone. My name is Caleb Rossico. Give me a second here, trying to advance my slideshow. I am with the Atlanta-based consulting team of TSW, who is managing this process for the city. And joining me this evening is also Christy Dodson, who is with our partner Code Studio, who's been helping us out. So before we get started, I wanted to give everyone a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing this evening. First and foremost, as Director Holmes mentioned, the purpose of this meeting is to really answer any questions that you may have about the draft Module 1, which was unveiled in early December. Additionally, however, we know that we may have some new folks, so we wanted to give a very brief background. But after that, we're going to go into the Q&A session directly. And as with our previous meetings, we have sort of two types of questions. The first ones are those that were submitted in advanced to us. And so what we did is we took the questions from the chat at the previous meeting that were not answered, and then we also received a lot of questions through the project website or other means. So we're going to answer those with some background and some exhibits. But then what we're going to do is we're going to give everyone an opportunity who has a question that has not been answered yet to do so in real time. My colleague, Christopher Myers, will be monitoring the chat for the duration of the meeting, and we'll be writing down any questions that you may have. So if you do have a question, if something comes up during the course of anything this evening, please put it in writing, and Christopher will paraphrase it and share it with us at the end of the meeting. And then finally, we're going to talk very briefly about next steps. So in terms of background, again, wanted to remind everyone that the update of the City of Atlanta zoning ordinance is part of a bigger initiative by the city that looks at updating both the comprehensive plan, which we call Plan A, which is the vision for what the city wants to be, and an update to the zoning code and regulations that implement that vision. And this is incredibly important because a plan is a guiding framework, and without the laws in place to actually ensure that the plan is properly implemented, the ability of the city to shape the future is not going to be as realized. So this is a truly once in a lifetime opportunity to look at both the planning of Atlanta and making sure that we have the appropriate regulations to support it. Now, we are coordinating very closely with that effort. We have developed a methodology to share information. And so it's very, very, very important to you all to know that if you make a comment during zoning that is more applicable to the comp plan, or during the plan that is more applicable to zoning, we have a lot of information sharing. And so if you would like to learn more about the Plan A effort, please visit atlantaforall.com and you can learn more. And they will have some meetings coming up very shortly. And so in terms of the process, as also a little bit of background information, we've been working on the zoning rewrite for quite a while now. Our goal is to finish up the draft 100% of the ordinance by spring. We will then be combining that into a revised ordinance, and then only at the middle of the summer will we begin the official adoption process. That zoning ordinance has been released or will be released in bite-sized pieces that we're calling modules. The modules are intended to contain similar types of zoning regulations. So for example, we've had one that talked about the form and the use of properties in the city. Module 2 has talked about sort of development standards, and Module 3 will be administrative. Now, what's really important is that we have released all of these modules as intentional discussion drafts, and I can't emphasize that enough. They are intentionally put out there to solicit feedback, solicit discussion. And so I'd like to just acknowledge that nothing is set in stone at this point, and we really do want to hear from you and reflect the changes as we move forward. We, again, will finalize those modules by the end of March. We will then revise them, put them into a 100% draft of the entire code, which will include the official zoning map mid to late summer. And only after that we'll begin the official adoption process, again, geared towards summer of 2025 at this point. So a little bit again to remind everyone what our focus of this evening is Module 2. This was unveiled on December 4th and really focused on the general regulations that apply citywide. So you're going to hear about things like parking, things like fences and walls, things like outdoor lighting. This is really everything in the zoning ordinance that is not about the form of a property or the permitted uses on a property. There will be a final module released on February 3rd that is going to talk about the administrative process of the code, and that will be followed up by a Q&A session on March 17th. And then finally, wanted to remind everyone that the zoning ordinance is only one of many ordinances that regulate growth and development really in the city of Atlanta and any other city. There is a parallel effort undergoing right now to update the tree protection ordinances. Director Holmes and my team has been very privy to that conversation and is very familiar with what they're doing, and we've been coordinating that effort. But there are also stormwater regulations that are given by the state. There are soil and environmental regulations provided by the state and noise ordinances. And then finally, very importantly, zoning is completely separate from things like building code or for things like housing code. And so we've made a very deliberate effort to only focus on things in zoning that really belong in zoning from a legal perspective. But if through the course of this effort, we identify that changes are needed in any of these other areas that are necessarily to align with the zoning ordinance, we will obviously be recommending parallel minor amendments to the city. Now, that is not to say we are not rewriting any of these other code sections, because we are not. But if we identify urgent, critical fixes, if you will, such as the name of zoning districts, we will be proposing amendments to align the two. And then finally, I did want to mention that we have made a strategic recommendation to the city to not rezone any properties as part of this code rewrite. We are doing what we call a one-to-one conversion, where if your property is zoned one thing today in Adair Park and it zones the same thing today in Midtown, it will be zoned the same thing after the new code is adopted. So really think of it as a conversion of one-to-one. Our hope, as many of you have identified in your written comments, is that these new zoning districts that we've created may be better suited to certain neighborhoods than what you have today. So the consulting team, the Department of City Planning, is very aware that there may be new zoning ordinances or zoning districts that are created that work better for your neighborhoods than what you have today, but any of those changes would have to occur after official adoption of the code. And then finally, if you do have any questions about how zoning districts might be changing in your neighborhood or on your property, on the project website, which I'll mention in a moment, there's a very detailed translation table that says what you are today and what you would be in the future. So with that said, I'd like to start with the questions. We've sort of divvied these up by team members. Some of those will be answered by myself. Again, I'm with TSW. Others will be answered by Director Kieta Holmes. And at the end of the day, she is the person that administers the zoning ordinance. So what she says is most important. And then, of course, Christy Dodson with Code Studio will also be answering several of your questions. Generally, the questions that we received in advance fell into 4 categories. There are a lot of folks that were asking sort of about the process. There were folks that were asking really about Module 1, but we wanted to respect those questions and answer a couple of them. A lot of questions about parking, and then a lot of miscellaneous questions. So we'll be answering those in that order. So the first question was submitted at our meeting last month, and it was, is there a Module 1 update that NPU chairs can share with their neighborhoods? Is there an update of the things that we have changed in that previous Module 1? And the answer is yes, there is. And in recognition that our website, which is at atlzoning.com, may be somewhat difficult to navigate at times, I wanted to show everyone precisely where that is. So from here on out, again, everything that we produce as a team, the meeting presentations, the draft deliverables, they're all being fed into this project website. To review the documents, you go to atlzoning.com. There is a red button in the top right that says Zoning Drafts. You click there. It will then take you to a page with all of the draft materials, both Module 1, current Module 2, and future Module 3. To read the actual draft of the ordinances, you will click Online Draft. And then you'll be taken to our sister website called Conveo, where we actually host everything. We have a separate hosting server. You will see that the current module that we're discussing with the community is always going to be at the top. So this is Module 2. But Module 1 has a subfolder. So you'll click on that. And in there, you will find a summary of form and use district updates. What we have done is we have listed every single change that was made between the first discussion draft of Module 1 and the subsequent amendment of Module 1 that was mentioned at the meeting in December. There's an overview that talks about what we've changed, and then there are several pages of text that talk about what we've changed. Additionally, for this particular one, I did want to point out that we saw that a lot of folks were having a hard time visualizing some of the changes on typical sites in residential neighborhoods. So we actually did a series of renderings that showed theoretical lots in both R4 and R5 zoning districts, what is permitted today, and then side by side, what would be permitted under the conversion of the new code. So we encourage MPU chairs to review those changes to see what some of the updates are, and really anyone who is interested in the City of Atlanta zoning update process. We'll be doing that as we modify every module going forth, but for the sake of time, we don't have the ability to walk through literally hundreds of lines of text telling everyone exactly what changed, but we are committed to transparency, and we have put this all online. The second question, which I'll turn over to Director Holmes, is whether the MPU chairs can be trained on the new code. Director Holmes? And you're muted.
Thank you, Caleb. The official way in which we communicate information to our MPU chairs or to any resident or stakeholder here in the City of Atlanta is through our official training module, which is NPUU or NPU University. We will be setting up several trainings for persons to take advantage of, and we'll likely do those in groups of stakeholders, one of those being MPU chairs as well as their zoning contacts.
Thank you. The next question was about whether there is a red line document of the existing zoning code versus the proposed zoning code. And unfortunately, there is not. And the reason for that is if you are all familiar with the City of Atlanta zoning ordinance, it is a 600 to 700 page single spaced document that is incredibly user unfriendly. About 95% of our work as part of this effort has just been cleaning things up, moving them around, adding graphics, putting tables. And so I can tell you in all honesty that if we were to do a red line, we have touched and updated almost the entire code, but it's primarily a cleanup update. And so we can't really provide that. However, we recognize that the community may not all be aware of what has been guiding this particular effort. And I did want to let everyone know that there is a very detailed document that was prepared several years ago that identifies all of the changes that are to be made in the code. It is, again, available on the project website. You would go to atlzoning.com. You would click participate. Under here, there is a library, if you will, called Explore and Learn. And on there, if you scroll down to the bottom, there are what are called diagnostic reports. There is a earlier diagnostic report from 2016, over 8 years ago, that talks about the kind of changes that would be needed to align the Atlanta zoning ordinance with the CDP at that time, with ongoing city policies, and with sort of coding best practices. And then there is an update that our team prepared about 3 years ago that reviews those changes, those recommendations in the context of the public feedback from some earlier meetings that we conducted, and very importantly, the Atlanta City design. So if you're interested in reading sort of every little thing that has guided our work, by all means, please go and look at both of those documents. Again, the 2023 update is probably what most folks are going to be interested in. You can see, again, every recommendation for what should change, what should not change. a lot of which we have used to vet with the community in the idea labs, in the focus workshops, and then as part of these ongoing discussions. Okay, the next question is, has this type of form-based zoning been implemented in any other city? And I'm going to turn that over to Christy with Code Studio.
And I think, as Caleb outlined in the previous question, one of the primary answers to this question is we have been taking a lot of the standards that have been used in different places around Atlanta and actually unifying those citywide. So a lot of the standards that you're seeing, 95% of the standards in the current document are actually currently used in Atlanta. They may not be used in all areas, it may be a few SPIs, it may be in a few of the overlay districts, but the vast majority of these standards are actually used in Atlanta. We're just unifying what we're naming things, how they're measured, and how they're defined, so that the document and the regulations are much more user friendly. If you want to look to other communities that have implemented codes, that they're certainly not exactly the same. No two ordinances are the same. They're all codes in cities across the U.S. are really custom made for each of those places. But codes that have similar graphics and tables and organization, you could look to places like Denver, Colorado, Raleigh, North Carolina, or even Greenville, South Carolina.
Great. And I would like to add that the city of Atlanta has had a very direct focus on improving the outcomes, the physical outcomes of development since really after the Olympics. All of the newer zoning districts that the city has created, things like mixed residential commercial, mixed multi-unit residential, neighbor commercial districts, all of those newer zoning districts really focus on ensuring a consistent form across the city. And so anyone who's been here for really any amount of time can very clearly look at the physical nature of development in places like Midtown or, along the East Side Beltline or even in the historic districts and see that the city has been moving towards a direction of improving the form, the physical shape of development. Okay. Next question is a big one. Again, really module one, but several folks asked and we wanted to answer this. What happens to what are called SPI districts, and I'll mention what that is in a moment, and historic districts? Again, we answered this before, but we felt that we needed to go into a little bit more detail. And I apologize to everyone in advance. This is a much more technical answer than much of what we're going to be giving tonight. Special public interest districts, SPIs, are zoning districts that the city has today that only apply to one part of the city. So for example, there is a customized SPI in Midtown. There are customized SPIs in Buckhead. There are several neighborhoods that have them. So they're really tailored zoning for one part of the city. And you may recall that one of the goals of this rewrite is to make it possible for all neighborhoods to be able to have that improved focus on design, not just the areas that have enough money to hire a consultant to do a customized zoning district. And so that leveling the playing field is really important. And so we've crafted a new zoning code that allows neighborhoods that want to opt in to more design to be able to do that. So most of the zoning SPI districts in the city are going to directly fall into the new format very, very easily. There's very little different from them. But we have identified that there are a couple of areas of the city that have such very unique zoning regulations that they're going to remain as what we're calling legacy districts. These are Fort McPherson, which is, if you're familiar with that property, talks about specific parts of the historic Fort McPherson campus, really could never apply anywhere else because it talks about specific buildings in that area. The other one is Buckhead Village, which has a very long legacy of zoning conditions and neighborhood negotiations that shaped that district. The Buckhead Lenox area, which is Lenox Mall, Phipps Plaza, and then portions of Piedmont and Peachtree Road, Midtown, and by this we mean the Midtown sort of high-rise area, not the Midtown Garden District, and then Greenbrier down Campbellton Road. So those are all going to change. Those are all going to remain, but they're going to be called legacy districts. And then finally, any associated design review committee or development committees associated with them or otherwise will also remain. So that's what's happening with SPIs. Historic districts are even a bit more complicated. Historic districts fall into two categories. The first category of historic district is the one that overlays regulations intended to protect the historic resource within an existing area. So I'm going to use my neighborhood, West End. We are zoned R4. You look at the zoning map, you look at the permitted uses of the property, it's all R4. But we have an overlay historic district that protects historic buildings from being torn down and requires design controls for new construction. So think of that as an overlay because the historic standards overlay on the underlying zoning. The second type of historic district is almost like an SPI, except it happens to be a historic district. It is a tailored set of regulations for a specific historic part of the city. And there are very few of these. But basically, it's going to have all of your quote unquote zoning functions. So it will protect historic buildings, it will have design controls, but it will also have the quote unquote zoning standards. So the use of property, the height of buildings, the parking requirements, et cetera. And this is generally the King District, portions of Cabbagetown, and a couple of other very small properties around the city. So what happens to those? What happens to those and what happens to the SPIs? So the historic districts will remain, but the SPIs that are remaining will also remain as legacy districts. But in order to make them fit into the new zoning ordinance, we do have to update a couple of things. And we wanted to point this out to you because we know many residents and property owners are very passionate about these areas. We will be standardizing the terms that are used in these SPIs and in these historic districts. So for example, there are words that the city is no longer going to have in their new zoning ordinance, such as half-depth side yard. It basically will be renamed to side street setback. We will go into those remaining SPIs and those historic districts and make sure that word is updated. Supplemental zone, which any of you who know zoning, is another term that is being replaced with a setback. So when you look at these areas, you're going to notice that there is a lot of cleanup, but it's all just to change the terminology. Now, with that said, there are two elements in both SPIs and historic districts that we are pulling out and putting them in the citywide code. The first one is the parking requirements. As we presented previously, the parking requirements are no longer going to be associated with your zoning. They're going to be associated with where you are in the city and your access to transit. So we have to pull them out and we have to put them in the general parking maps. We have made sure that those neighborhoods with specific parking regulations, and I'm going to mention Home Park here, I'm going to mention parts of Cabbagetown Historic District, not Cabbagetown Historic District, Castleberry Hill Historic District. We've reflected all of that in the citywide parking standards, but we had to move it. We had to move it to the parking section. And then we're also doing that with the streetscape requirements, because again, they're going to be citywide. So again, very important to a lot of you, and they will change, but they're not changing a lot. So the second topic we had a lot of questions about was parking. The first one was related to parking zone 1 and whether it includes restaurants. So as a little bit of reminder, we are separating parking requirements from your zoning district, and we are tying parking to the kind of neighborhood you're in, availability of transit, and the general walkability of it. Parking zone 1 is the part of the city where there are no parking requirements for any use, including restaurants today. It is, generally speaking, areas of the city that already have those standards, and they're shown in yellow on the map. So today, the city of Atlanta has several zoning districts and overlays with no parking minimums. For example, the Ponce Highland Historic District on the east side of town has no parking requirement. We have shown that in this map. Downtown and Midtown have no parking requirements. We have shown that in the map. And then anywhere within a half-a-mile walk of a MARTA station or a streetcar stop or bus rapid transit, including the Summerhill line under construction, also has no parking requirement. So we've simply gone in and mapped those. So nothing really is changing there. This is all current law. The second parking question has related to the residential neighborhoods zoned R1 through R5 within the Beltline overlay. So the question is, what are the current standards in the Beltline overlay for R1 through R5, which is, again, generally house districts, and by default, what's happening there? So to remind everyone, the Beltline overlay, which is shown at right, is a geographic area that roughly runs a half a mile from the center line of the 22-mile corridor. Recently, City Council amended the zoning code so that there is no parking required within this area. But as many of you have pointed out in your various emails, this exception doesn't apply everywhere. So if you are so it does not apply to existing lots of record, meaning a lot that is already there, that is zoned R1 through 5, those are exempt from it. So if I am a R1 through 5 lot and I'm a lot of record, none of this applies. I technically do have some parking requirement today. It does apply to those districts adjacent to the Beltline corridor. So a house lot that may back up to the Beltline has no parking requirement. And it would also apply to newly created lots, lots that are not lots of record as I interpret it. Now, with that said, so there is a parking requirement for R1 through R5 in most of the Beltline overlay. But there are some very important caveats that also change the validity of that statement. The first one is that, as I mentioned earlier, regardless of the Beltline overlay, if a property zoned R1 through R5 is within a half a mile walk of high capacity transit, there's no requirement. So it's sort of this supersedes the Beltline requirement. Additionally, any house built before 1965 also has no parking requirement. This is a citywide provision that exempts buildings built before parking requirements existed from having them. Now, the interesting thing is that, well, what about new houses? So technically, new houses that have parking adjacent to them on the street also do not have a practical parking requirement. And I'm going to show you what this means. So this lot in West End, which is zoned R4A, was built about 5 years ago. It is a historic, lot of record, but because it has on-street parking, they were not required to build any off-site parking space. So again, generally speaking, in most of your in-town neighborhoods where the lots are, 30 to 50 feet wide, you already get credit for 2 parking spaces on the street immediately in front of them. And so I remind everyone of that because this has been something that's been on the books for a while. Very few people have taken advantage to it based on my sort of review of new development in the city. Most developers are going to recognize that if they're able to provide a parking space, they'll be able to sell the home for more money. but there is that exemption in the code today that I wanted to remind everyone of. And so again, for that reason, parking zone 2, which is the Beltline overlay and a couple of other areas, is proposed to not have a parking requirement for R1 through R5. I know that's a very long answer, but it's something that quite a few of you have written both Director Holmes and me about, that we wanted to use this as an opportunity to answer. The next question is very easy. Will there be an option for parking variances? Absolutely. Module 3 is going to talk about parking variances. Those could include both if you happen to be in an area where parking is required and you can't meet it, there'll be a process for providing less parking, but there will also be a process for what do you do where you're in an area with a maximum amount of parking and you want to provide more. So all of that will be forthcoming in Module 3. Those are going to replace what we call special exceptions, but again, not really any change from what we have today. The next question is about the design of parking. Will parking lot screening requirements restrict pedestrian access from the sidewalk? I'll turn it over to Christy to explain what those are.
Thanks, Caleb. The short answer is no. We are actually encouraging more pedestrian connections from the sidewalk to the front door of buildings, and I'll talk about a couple places where you can see where those regulations are laid out. So where we talk about that screening along parking lots, that is a frontage screen, and that is on page 8-49. When you go into that section, you can read in there that there are allowances for breaks in those screens for pedestrian and bicycle access. And further in on page 8-14 is where we lay out those pedestrian access requirement types. So different zoning districts will have different requirements of how often you actually have to make connections from the sidewalk to the front door of buildings. So I just wanted to point those sections out for folks to let you know that not only are we providing allowances for that in the frontage screen, but we are actually requiring that there are connections to the front door of buildings.
Great, thank you. Christy, I'll let you answer the next one as well.
Yeah, so I'm gonna talk a bit about sublots. There are a lot of questions around what are sublots and where are they allowed. And I think this diagram that it overlays on an existing development shows the idea of sublots well. And a way that you can think about it is sublots really is just a term for what we call today of zero lot line. So when you're looking at the requirements for a form district or what uses are allowed, that really is talking about the lot itself. So on that lot, that's where you think about the minimum lot size, the area required, how wide the lot has to be. Sublots really are just a mechanism when there are more than one primary dwelling unit allowed, and it's for the purpose of ownership. So this example that we're showing here is a townhouse type development, and so a sublot would be created within that lot so that each of those units could be sold individually, like a townhouse. So I do want to emphasize that these are for primary dwelling units. So each sublot must contain a primary dwelling unit. And so accessory dwelling units are not primary uses. They are accessory. It's inherent to the name. So those could not occupy a sublot by themselves. There would have to be a primary unit on that sublot.
Thank you.
And the next question, this kind of gets into the miscellaneous category of questions. There were a lot of questions around transitions and what has changed with transitions. So something that you may be familiar with today are the transition requirements that are actually listed separately. So in some districts, there are transitional yards, and others there are transitional buffers. So those are sort of landscaping requirements. And then transitional height planes. And there are different diagrams for how a building height may have to change based on its location adjacent to a lower intensity district. So I do want to emphasize that transitions are those requirements when there is a lower intensity district next to a higher intensity district. Often that lower intensity district is called a protected district. And then it's against a higher intensity district. And that's where you get these separate requirements. And in today's code, these exist in today's code, they're listed separately as transitional yards, transitional buffers, and transitional height planes. So how are those changing? At a high level, we're really just organizing the information in a more user-friendly way. That is the primary change when it comes to transitions. So instead of it being listed in text, we are identifying in a table. So if you see on the right-hand side here, this page, if you want to reference it in the document, it's page 8-35. And you see this table and you see the protected districts and the transition requirements. We're calling these different types. So we have a type A through D transition requirements, and you have the district of the subject lot. So if you are in an urban general 3 lot and you are adjacent to different types of protected districts, so if you're adjacent to a house district, you're required to have a type A. If you are adjacent to a neighborhood scale district, the applicant can choose if they have a type A or type B. So transition is required and they must choose one of those two options. So the table really lays out what those requirements are. And one thing I want to emphasize is each of those elements, the transitional yard, the landscape buffer, and a height setback, those are all still in these transition types. We're just illustrating them all together within those transition types. So transition type A really is the standard that exists today. And so this applies anytime a house scale district is adjacent to a higher intensity district. So if you're a higher intensity district next to a house scale district, you must use transition type A. And these are the requirements that exist today. These illustrations should actually look relatively familiar to those who are familiar with transitional height planes. So we have a minimum transition screening. So there's a required landscape buffer. And it's actually a bit more intense than what is required today. There are 2 options for that landscape buffer, and that existing height plane, again, is illustrated as it is in today's code. So transition type A really is what exists today. Transition B, there are some districts where you can choose transition type A or B. So this is in lieu of type A. And this usually applies when there's a 3 or a 5-story district that's adjacent to neighborhood scale districts. So think about those more traditional neighborhoods where you may have some smaller scale commercial uses along a corridor, and that backs up to a neighborhood scale, more residential area. So those older neighborhoods is where this generally exists. So there is transition screening required. So there is a thinner landscape buffer that is required if you provide a fence, or a wider landscape buffer if a fence is not provided. And it replaces the transitional height plane, that sort of height angle that was in the previous drawing, with a fixed building setback against the protected district. So it pushes those upper stories back a bit further than what the transitional height plane does today. And then transition type C, you'll notice these get a bit more intense. So generally, B is for buildings that are 3 or 5 stories against protected districts. C and D is when you get even more intense districts. The 8-story districts, the 15 or 25-story districts against protected districts. So you'll see the building height gets pushed back further and further as we go down the line. So transitional type C, again, is in lieu of the existing standards that we've illustrated in type A. This applies when there are 8-story districts that are adjacent to or across the street from neighborhood scale districts. And again, we have a couple different landscape options. So there's a requirement for the landscape buffer, a thinner one with a fence or a deeper one with more screening. And again, it replaces the traditional height plane with that step back of a building that's more fixed at fixed intervals. And then finally, transition type D, that should say D. And this is when you get the tallest district next to a protected district. And so you can see there's an even additional building step back. You can sort of see that wedding cake form as the building form gets pushed back. So similar to the previous ones, there is a landscape requirement in that transitional yard, and then those fixed step backs that happen with building massing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now I'd like to answer the next one too, which is a very detailed.
Yes. I'm going to keep on a roll with all these technical ones. Technical but important. So explaining floor area. How has it changed? Why do basements now count? And floor area, I will say, is most commonly used when we are talking about floor area ratio. So that is the ratio between how much bulk of a building is in proportion to the size of the lot. That's where the ratio comes in. And it's important because floor area and floor area ratio, the idea behind that is controlling for the bulk and mass of the building, how much building you're getting in relation to the size of the lot. And so the change that we're making is really to make that more predictable. We want to make sure that we're actually controlling for the bulk and mass of the building in the most predictable way. So floor area is now being measured to the outside face of exterior walls of the building. We really tried to align this measurement with how architects measure floor area in the building code. So it's not having to be measured differently. This includes any structure that is both enclosed and covered. There are definitions for enclosed and covered in the zoning. And it includes things like vertical circulation, including stairways, elevator shafts. Again, we're trying to really get at the bulk and mass of the building here. So we're including all of that in the calculation. It includes any spaces and attics and basements that have a height of 7 feet or more. So that is considered an occupiable space when the height, that ceiling height is 7 feet or more. So this is new, and attics and basement would be included. And then we're including any area of an attached garage that exceeds 200 square feet. So you get a little bit of a freebie there if it's under 200 square feet, but generally garages are larger than that. So we want to include that in the floor area calculation because it contributes to the bulk and mass of the building. And so what does that mean for floor area ratio? Because this new approach really better accounts for all interior spaces in floor area, that means we also had to adjust the floor area ratio a little bit. So we are more accurately measuring the floor area of the building in this new definition. And so that means that we needed to tweak up the floor area ratio that was allowed a little bit so that the allowances would be similar to what is allowed today. So as an example for this, this building, a historic building in Midtown Garden District, that basement has a ceiling height greater than 7 feet. And so it would now be included in the new calculation of floor area. And so because of that, we would tweak up the floor area ratio that is allowed a bit so that this building would be conforming and would be able to be built at a similar bulk and mass. The floor area ratio reflects what is allowed under today's code.
Great. Thank you, Christy. And I wanted to mention part of why we're doing this is in our recommendation to the city, we have a great appreciation for the fact that a lot of creative builders and such will build a structure and say it's a basement and get their building permits, and then someone goes in and turns it into a bedroom or an office. And so we want to make very sure that what is being built truly reflects the sort of physical conditions on the property. So we felt that closing those quote unquote loopholes is very consistent with best practices and predictable outcomes. And then the final, well, not the final question. One of the other miscellaneous questions relates to how the city handles encroachments into the right-of-way. And so I will let Director Holmes answer this one.
So encroachments are handled via an encroachment agreement. And yes, if you are able to get an encroachment agreement, you will be able to extend a balcony or an awning into the public right of way. And if this question was related to just extending over the sidewalk, those allowances will be allowed in the code as well.
Thank you. And then the next question is probably the one that we've received the most comments on to date. Director Holmes, why is the number of unrelated people that can live together being reduced? What about students?
So currently, the definition of family, which this question is related to, is quite permissive in the city of Atlanta, and it is also quite old and dated compared to what many people consider a family today. What do I mean when I say permissive? The definition of family in the city of Atlanta allows the following: any person who is related by blood, marriage, or adoption, plus an unlimited number of domestic servants, plus 4 roomers. At a minimum, that can be 10 persons living together in whatever dwelling type it is. And that could be fine if it is 10 family members living together. However, the unlimited number of domestic servants may exceed the size of a dwelling or may be a bit overburdensome if you're considering what a family can or cannot be. I want to remind everybody that the definition is a draft and it may change. It is drafted that way to receive feedback from everyone, and the department is even considering not having a definition for family because today the definition of family is used as an enforcement tool, and it enforces rooming houses or the illegal use of rooming houses in districts where a rooming house is not permitted. And so the department is considering a definition change or may perhaps no definition at all.
Great. So those conclude the questions that we have received in advance. We have about 40 minutes to answer any questions from the audience. So Christopher,
Yes.
if anyone
It looks
has
like you muted for a second. Yes, we've got several great questions. I'll just start at the top. Will Atlanta Zoning 2.0 or the revisions to the CDP change any existing zoning lines?
No.
Asked and answered. Can property zoning be converted since you will not change property zoning to match the district or area zoning? I take that question to mean, is it possible to rezone a property after this process is over?
Yes. Rezonings will occur up until a certain point. With the current code, there probably will be some type of blackout period to allow the new code to be adopted, and there likely may not be any rezonings. And then after the code is adopted, there will be rezonings that take place after that.
Are there any changes being made to the short-term rental ordinance in the new code?
Short-term rental is not in the new code other than it is a permitted use in certain districts, either by right or by a special use permit. Please remember that short-term rental is a license in the city of Atlanta, and you are required to apply for it annually. It is managed by the Office of Buildings, and there are code amendments that were introduced by the department several weeks ago, and you will see that in your NPUs in the short term, and you will have the ability to opine on the provisions or the amendments to that text. But again, it is not a zoning regulation. It is a license in the city of Atlanta.
The next question is more site specific. Why are you proposing Peachtree Heights East to not be R1 like Peachtree Heights West? And they add to that question, is there a limit to the number of residences or dwellings in the back of a house? Can it be an RBO or VRBO?
We are not rezoning that neighborhood at all. It would be a direct one-to-one conversion. So I may ask the person who wrote that to please send more detail to ATL zoning 2@atlantagA.gov, and we'll look into that. But we're not changing the zoning of any properties. It would be the one-to-one conversion. So unless they're two different districts today, we're carrying forth what they have. Kieta, I'll let you answer the VRBO question. Again, I think you just did.
Properties that are zoned R1, I'm sorry, is it an ADU question or is it a VRBO question, a short-term rental question? Short-term rental licenses are not restricted by zoning code. Short-term rental licenses are regulated via a license in the city, and then it's an application process.
Okay, and I just offer to the person who raised that question, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to email the team. Okay, so the next question.
I will add point of, this may be implied in the question. Today, under current zoning, if you are in a zoning district that has ADUs, accessory dwellings, you are only allowed to use them for short-term rental if the owner lives on the property. So that is a current regulation, and the current draft does carry that forward, if that adds clarity.
The next question we have, will Midtown SPI 17 be a legacy district?
No. SPI 17, which is Piedmont Avenue in Midtown, we have given it a unique use district because there are some unique uses in there, but the physical nature of Piedmont Avenue is very similar to the physical nature in the rest of the Garden District. And so we've actually converted that to a standard form district.
Let's see here. Okay, do ADUs have to be behind a main structure? And they also ask, is 850 square feet the maximum size, or is it 10%?
Do you want me to take that one, Caleb? We do have requirements that accessory structures do have to be behind primary structures. And so if the accessory dwelling unit, it's an accessory unit, so it would need to be behind the primary structure. And the size is 850 square feet as proposed in the current draft. So there's no percentage associated with it. It's 850 square feet.
With the
And I will
exception,
say,
there are a couple of historic districts that do allow larger than 850. I believe Ponce Highland is one, maybe Druid Hills is another. Don't quote me on Druid Hills part, but we are going to be carrying those over into the new district. So if a historic district allows a larger ADU as sort of one of the historic pattern, that would continue to be allowed in that historic district.
and if you would like to read the other, those other requirements, those were issued in the Module 1 documents as Caleb outlined, so you can navigate and find those use standards associated with accessory dwelling units. That will be in the chapter associated with use.
Will the Brookwood Hills Conservation District remain in place?
Yeah, we plan on doing a direct conversion of everything in currently chapter 20, which is the historic and conservation districts. Those are just carry forward.
Have the parking zones been updated to include the infill stations?
No. There is what Christopher is referring to. There was some discussion about what happens if MARTA builds 4 infill stations. However, because we don't know how real those are, we have put a provision in the ordinance that says that the transit zones are as mapped, or if you can designate that you are within a half a mile of a station. So for example, if the East Side Beltline extension happens, an applicant who is on that could go to Director Holmes and say, look, I am within a 400-foot walk of this new streetcar stop, and then Director Holmes could grant them that. There would be no zoning or map change needed. So that would be very similar if MARTA opens any new rail stations or bus rapid transit lines, including Campbellton Road. That's another one where if that project actually begins construction, then it immediately becomes a parking zone 1 because of the existing high capacity transit ordinances.
The next question, can you describe the 1-to-1 zoning conversion as it relates to density increases? This person lists a specific example, R5 to U4 increases density from a 2-family home to a 2-family home plus 4 ADUs.
They may be looking at an older version. Christy, I'll allow you to answer that.
Yeah, so I would encourage that person to go look at the Module 1 updates. So we outlined all of the revisions that we made to Module 1. There were revisions to the number of accessory dwelling units allocated to those districts that allow accessory dwelling units today. So in R5 today, that is a 2-family district, and that is allowed to have an ADU for each one of those 2. So if it's a 2-family, you get 2 accessory units because you have 2 primary units. So accessory dwelling unit per primary unit in the R5 conversion. That is all outlined in detail in those documents for the revision of Module 1.
The next question, will there be a definition for impermeable materials, specifically a example list?
Yes, there will be, and we are aware that Director Holmes is having some conversations with some neighborhoods about um, a little bit more about that. And so that is absolutely one of the things that we're going to be clarifying. We do want to make sure that we align as much as possible with stormwater, although that isn't always possible.
I will say also, please look at page 3-10. There is a list of what is included as an impervious surface on that page. And if you have any specific comments about that list or how it may be clarified further, please do provide that feedback.
Are there any parking requirements for PZ2?
PZ2 is the current Beltline overlay and a couple of others. The only parking requirement in there, as was presented last time, is today the Beltline overlay does continue to require parking for bars, restaurants, certain alcohol-oriented uses, and we have carried that forward. So when you look at the parking table, which I believe is, Christy, I'll let you find the number. When you look at the parking table, you'll notice that there's no parking requirement in PZ2 except for those uses that I mentioned, because those uses currently have a parking requirement within the Beltline overlay, even though nothing else does.
And if you're looking at the document, that is located in 8-20. The parking table starts.
And this next question is related. Can you describe the rationale for no parking requirements in the Beltline overlay?
I will allow Director Holmes to answer that. That was a policy decision of the City Council.
When the legislation was circulated by DCP last year, after the paper was introduced, it proposed no parking maximums on the Beltline overlay. The assumption was, or is, that the Beltline overlay is a transit corridor, and where there is transit, that there not be any parking requirements. That was overwhelmingly approved by our NPUs and then was adopted as policy by our City Council.
And just to clarify, I think you said there are no parking maximums. Did you mean no parking minimums?
I'm sorry, minimums. No parking minimums.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
The next question we have, does floor area have to be conditioned space?
It only has to be enclosed and covered. So many garages, for example, are not conditioned, but that would be included in the proposed new definition of floor area because it is an enclosed and covered space.
Again, our goal is to close any potential loophole, focus on the form of the building, and we have to raise the FAR accordingly because we have all these exemptions today.
Do the number of bedrooms or bathrooms influence maximum capacity? I assume that's for a dwelling.
That is not a zoning matter. The city doesn't regulate that through zoning, only through with housing code.
Next question, to encourage historic preservation, can pre-1948 buildings be exempt from the 7-foot basement and attic being included in FAR?
This is a comment that we received this morning on Conveo. It was noted, and Director Holmes, I may let you answer this, that currently, if you are an older home, you can actually build out your attic regardless of FAR, if that sounds right. I mentioned on Conveo that we're going to be looking at that in more detail. It's something we have to discuss.
Okay.
And that may not be true.
Are permitted uses addressed in Module 2 or Module 3?
Module 1.
Since rooming houses were mentioned, how would one find out whether an existing rooming house is in a district that allows it or whether it is non-conforming?
Rooming houses are either listed as a permitted use or a use permitted by special use permit in each of the zoning districts. And if it's not mentioned in the zoning district, either as a permitted use or as a use by special use permit, it is not allowed at all. There are a few rooming houses that do exist in the city, and they have certificates or licenses that are issued by the police department.
For UG3 conversion of RG2, will there be any transition protections for new buildings built to the more dense standards where it abuts older RG3 standards?
Yeah, this is another one of those comments that we have been inundated with, and we are going to be looking at this. There are certain parts of the city, specifically parts of Virginia Highland between Ponce and I believe St. Charles, and then parts of Piedmont Avenue and parts of the Garden District and parts of Ansley Park that are currently zoned RG3 and RG2. There would be no transition between similarly zoned properties as proposed, but it has been suggested that we might want to look at whether we've chosen the correct conversion. And so we're going to be looking at that in close detail, recognizing that conversions have to apply and have to work citywide. So please stay tuned.
If a property is completely destroyed, will property owners be required to rebuild the same size, floor, parking area, etc., or can you build something different that meets community standards?
I think that's a non-conformity question, and we'll address non-conforming regulations in Module 3.
Okay, what impact will this 2.0 zoning have? There's an abbreviation here on AW and Monroe Road.
AW.
I believe that's Amsterdam Walk.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that property, Kieta, may I talk about zoning conditions?
I didn't Chris, can you repeat the question?
They're asking about what will 2.0 do to Amsterdam Walk, the recent rezoning. And so
actually the property, so let me just say this, Caleb, before you answer. So Amsterdam Walk has currently not been before City Council. It is currently held in zoning committee with all the recommendations from the zoning review board, staff, and the NPU. So there hasn't been any actual final action on it yet. Go ahead, Caleb.
Great. But with that said, typically developments like Amsterdam Walk have a lot of zoning conditions associated with them. And as we mentioned at a previous meeting, we do plan on carrying forward all zoning conditions from 2000 on. So if you are a resident in a neighborhood and you have spent a lot of time negotiating certain conditions for a property, we are going to carry those forward. Those will continue to apply. You'll be able to look at the zoning map and you'll be able to see them, but they're going to occur as part of the legislation, not actually in the code per se. It's part of the map legislation.
Will the Atlanta 2.0 team be available to meet with neighborhood zoning boards for additional questions?
No, all questions that are related to the zoning ordinance should be either sent to the email box for ATL 2.0 or added directly to Conveyo.
Does the definition of family align with any HUD definition of family?
It is one of several definitions of family that we are considering. The department is considering if the department can decides to add a definition for family.
Will SPI 21 West End Adair Park be considered a legacy district?
No, SPI 21 is one of those districts that are going to be converted to the new module. We looked very closely at that. I live 25 feet from it. It is very similar to the previous C1, C2, or C3 zoning. And so we've very comfortably converted that to the new nomenclature, and it's shown in the conversion table. I'm sorry.
The next question we have, why is there a difference in the number of allowable accessory dwelling units and accessory dwelling unit type structures? This person specifically references RN1-11 compared to RH1-9.
RN. So generally, and Christy, I'll let you look at those references. If you are an existing part of the city, most of the areas that allow ADUs only allow one. Most of them. If you are in an area of the city that allows accessory dwelling units and you are limited to one today, you are assigned a maximum of 1 ADU under the conversion. We did hear that there may be some neighborhoods in the future, again, so none of this would be mapped, that might be interested in allowing multiple ADUs. And so in the spirit of making a zoning ordinance that was future-proof, we did create a couple of form districts that, again, will not apply anywhere initially, so that neighborhoods that want to allow multiple ADUs could opt in and go through the rezoning process in the future. So I believe that that is probably what is being referenced to. But again, those will not be mapped up front. They are not shown on the conversion table today because there are no properties zoned accordingly in the city today.
Do you have any projections on how many ADUs could or are likely to be built under the revised ordinance?
We do not. I mean,
Let's
in
see.
terms of the places where ADUs are allowed, I want to emphasize this. If an ADU is allowed today, an ADU will be allowed under the new code. If you are in an area of the city that does not permit ADUs today, and I'm talking to R1, R2, R3, you would not be allowed an ADU under the new code. We have been incredibly careful based on the hundreds of emails that we received after releasing the first draft of Module 1 to make sure that there is a one-to-one conversion. So no change with regard to ADUs. That was initially proposed. That is no longer up for consideration.
Will future Beltline platforms in neighborhoods for streetcar be considered high-density transit stops?
Yes, provided they are actually building the line. There is a standard in the high capacity transit ordinance today that says it has to be, there's an FTA term like let for construction or something like that. So it really has to be a real project. It has to be funded. It has to be under construction. One cannot draw a line on paper and say that there might be rail here in the future. It has to be a real project in order to qualify for that exemption.
Why is there a parking maximum for childcare and medical centers in PZ2?
There is a current maximum in the Beltline overlay, but we are aware that individuals have expressed concern that that might be a bit low for childcare centers, and that is one of the things that we are going to be looking at in the revised draft for both of those areas, both of those permitted uses.
Are the new FAR lot coverage and setback standards in the revised Module 1?
Yes.
And where would someone go to find that?
As was shown previously, and you'll be able to review the presentation, go to the project website, click on the top right where it says review drafts, click review online drafts, and then Module 1 will be a button at the bottom. You can go in there and you can look at all of them.
When will the modules be fully adopted? Is there still time to comment on Module 1? And as a follow-up, can you also share what will be covered in Module 3?
Great question. So we, and I failed to mention this, I'm sorry about this. We are taking comments on every single module through March 31st. We recognize that your observations on a zoning district may depend on the citywide standards or may depend on the administrative procedures. So all of those documents are available on the website for comment through the end of March at a minimum. Our goal as a consulting team is once we hear your comments, we will continue to work with the Department of City Planning, but we're going to combine those all into a single revised draft that we will turn over to the city, and I will let Director Holmes speak to the adoption process.
Currently, we are scheduled to conclude, we being the team as well as Department of City Planning, are scheduled to conclude all of the modules, questions and answers, and reviews and revisions by early summer of 2025. At that time, the department leadership will decide on the next steps with regard to adoption.
Our goal as a team of consultants in the city is we beg all of you, if you have observations or you have concerns, please let us know now. We are hoping that we can do what the same team was able to do in Decatur, where by the time it got to the official adoption draft, all the issues had been ironed out, and we did not have a single opposition or support at the city council meeting because everything had been taken care of. We want to make sure that any comments you have, now is the time to tell us before we finalize it and before we start the official adoption process. It makes it much easier for everyone involved, including the stakeholders.
And I just want to add this, Caleb, that the department wants and is begging for your feedback because we want to get to an adoption process that runs smoothly and that we are able to provide a regulatory tool that benefits the residents as well as the zoning administrators. I'm sure that many of you all are frustrated as much as the department is frustrated with the many numerous rules that many numerous rules that are in the code and the many different ways to measure things. And I think many of you have recognized the diagrams and the schematics that are clear and very direct with regard to how things are measured. And if we get to a point where we're about to start the adoption process and we're inundated with more and more comments, then we will have to start the process over and we will delay delivering it to you.
Christopher, I do have a follow-up question. I was looking at the chat. Evidently, we did not answer the question regarding ADUs correctly. The question was, why are ADUs not allowed in R1 through R3 today? Kieta, would you like to answer that?
They are currently not allowed in R1 through R3. It was not something that that those areas of town were specifically interested in. And so like many other things in the code, we do allow a lot of customizations and specialty for particular portions of town. And so while there are no accessory dwelling units in properties that are zoned R1 through R3, there are accessory structures that are permitted.
Thank you.
The next question we have, will new arborist provisions to the new zoning codes be addressed in Module 3?
They will not. The tree protection ordinance is a separate document, and it is governing the trees and trees here in the city under a separate document. As a part of this update to the code, we are moving things that are not specific to zoning regulations out of the zoning ordinance and letting those ordinances stand on their own and regulate on their own.
I would like to mention we have coordinated with the arborist division, and specifically, if you look at the draft, you'll notice that we've increased the tree planting size in sidewalks. We have standardized the minimum tree size, tree caliper to satisfy the code. And I think most importantly, we've done two things. Today, the zoning ordinance requires developments to provide a certain amount of open space, and it treats those the same regardless of whether you are clear cutting the property and putting grass or doing a rooftop deck. We have built into the definition of amenity space a bonus amenity space for the conservation of specimen trees and higher quality trees. And so that is really as much as we can do within zoning, is to create incentives. The mandatory requirements, as Director Holmes mentioned, will come out of the tree protection ordinance. But we've tried to put as many carrots in the zoning as we can, recognizing that there is a bigger TPO effort underway.
The next question, can you summarize in a few words for a lay audience member and a voter, what are the benefits of this major update expected to be for the city?
Director Holmes, would you like to answer that?
The city will receive a document that is easier to administer. It will, what we hope the document will do, will minimize errors with regard to administration. Because the code is so large at this point, there is no clear understanding in some cases with regard to how things are measured, the size of things with regard to bulk and mass. When you heard Chrissy talk about FAR and the change we're making to the FAR, with regard to design controls that are citywide, all those things will be citywide requirements. And so we hope that this document that is created for the residents of the city of Atlanta, as well as the people who administer the document, is something that is clear and concise and that everyone can easily understand.
And I would like to add to Director Holmes, if any of you, whether you're a homeowner, a developer, or just an interested party, the usability piece is incredibly important. There is an entire industry of very expensive paid consultants that have to be retained by neighborhoods or developers in order to get projects entitled in the city. We hope that by creating a more user-friendly code, that the zoning will be much more accessible, whether you're a resident, whether you're a developer, whether you're a business owner. The other thing that's also really important, again, I'm going to give a shout out to the Office of Zoning and Development staff. They are tasked with administering over 240 zoning districts today. That may only vary by one or two things in the general standards. That means that it takes a really long time to review plans because they have to make sure that every provision of that particular district is adhered to. And so we hope that by standardizing the terms where we can, it will help with expediting the process. And again, if you're a homeowner, you will have sympathy for how long that can take to get your zoning permits at times.
The next question we have, will tree ordinances override lot use for placement of ADUs or other structures? This person references a concern with losing urban canopy.
With regard to legislation that was recently introduced related to the tree protection ordinance, there is a companion paper that the NPUs will receive in the short order with regard to an administrative variance with regard to tree preservation. It is believed that that will minimize impact of trees when it is related to structures on a lot. That provision is also carried over into 2.0, where setbacks can be adjusted. For side setbacks can be adjusted with regard to preservation, and to also work with any type of encumbrances on a lot. Again, we will only be referencing where necessary, referencing the TPO or the tree protection ordinance. The tree protection ordinance is a separate document, and that separate document will govern the preservation of the tree canopy here in the city.
Where would I find parking protections for legacy residents? This person references a concern with current residents needing to share very few on-street parking spaces where developers aren't providing new parking.
Not. The ability to park on streets is regulated by ATL DOT. A lot of these areas were built without parking, so that would be something that ATL DOT is responsible for within the right of way.
How many residences are allowed in the ADUs in Peachtree Heights East?
Again, the number is the same citywide, so that would be regulated by the definition of family or household, wherever that ends up falling. Now, realistically, these buildings are rather small, so there is going to be a building code maximum occupancy that comes into play depending on size.
Will the new zone definitions make it easier to build denser housing types?
Absolutely, in certain areas of the city. Where are those? Well, a lot of the major corridors that are zoned commercial today, so Roswell Road, again, Campbellton Road, Metropolitan Parkway, it will be much easier to build housing in those areas. Within the neighborhoods, we are not changing the zoning map, so you would not see any increase in the number. However, if certain neighborhoods through neighborhood planning exercises decide that they would like to have more housing allowed in those areas, this zoning code makes it much, much easier to accommodate than the current regime, wherein they have to write a whole new customized zoning district. Under this zoning code, they will be able to apply standards to those areas based on what is in their neighborhood plan.
Are the definitions of low density mixed use, medium mixed use, and high density mixed use terms utilized in Plan A and the Beltline Master Plan the same?
Plan A, which is a comprehensive plan, has a draft table that shows which zoning districts are permitted in those land use designations. We're going to have to prepare a whole new one when this new code is adopted, but I would ask you to refer to Plan A. Those terms have nothing to do with the zoning ordinance.
Will fences and walls be addressed in the next module?
They're in Module 2.
And if you want to reference on that, I will give a bit of a caveat on that. So fences and walls are located in they start on 8-56. There are different fence types and wall standards in that section. We do need to go back in Module 1, even in the revised version that's on Conveyo, you'll notice that when it lists on those tables fence requirements, it's highlighted. It's because we need to go back and revise those. When we drafted the revisions to Module 1, we had not yet created the fence types that are in Module 2. So know that those need to be updated. But if you do want to see the fence types and the wall standards, those are in Module 2, starting on 8-56.
And generally speaking, they're no different from current. I think we've lowered the fence in neighborhoods from 4 feet to 3.5 to align citywide, but really no change from current.
Does zoning address the burying of utility lines?
It does not.
Will there be provisions to allow someone to build on piers high enough to get above flood zone, such as that in Vine City?
You're allowed to do it now.
I'm sorry, Kieta?
I'm saying that's something that you can do now. There is no prohibition on piers.
Yeah, we did receive that comment in writing. Thank you. And we do want to make sure where we talk about maximum elevation that we do allow piers by right in flood zones. So that's on our radar.
Is there a minimum lot size you can build a house on? Will this be unified across Atlanta?
It varies by zoning district.
That can be found in Module 1 on the zoning district page. So find the form district that you're associated with, and it'll list a minimum lot width and minimum lot area.
How many pages is the draft of the new code versus the old?
So I've got it printed out. It's the new ordinance is about 700 pages. Because we've gone to graphics, it may be similar, but I will assure you, I beg you all to look at the current zoning ordinance, any zoning district, and look at the current. It really isn't about the number of pages. Sometimes having white space makes something more user-friendly. So we have, it will probably be a similar in page number, but a lot more graphics, a lot more tables, a lot more user-friendly layout.
Okay, and we're towards the bottom here of the list, and we're at 8 o'clock. I'm going to try to paraphrase this question. The term direct conversion has been mentioned quite a bit. In the case of a current R4 neighborhood, if a home is torn down, are there different zoning requirements that would apply? And so in following up on that question, they're asking, are properties that are replaced by a tear down governed by the exact same requirements as existing homes in an R4 neighborhood?
They are governed by whatever the zoning requires. So would be no different from current. I will mention, if you attended the Module 1 meeting, you will notice, you will remember that we've done a couple of things to make new homes fit in better. we've actually required houses to match the setback on the street. Right now, they have the option not to do that. We think that'll help. We also have some standards in there about having porches and stoops if that's the pattern, but we have not decreased the height. We have not decreased the massing because those are very significant policy decisions that we have recommended not to apply citywide. If you want to go that route, there are new tools that can do that. There are what we call conservation districts, but they would have to be opted into after the new code is adopted.
Do you want to take any more questions?
How many do we have?
There may be a couple still to paraphrase earlier that maybe folks have gone back to expand on, but at the bottom, or last one I see right here, will guest houses continue to be limited to a wet bar but no kitchen compared to an ADU allowed to have a full kitchen?
Yes.
That's the last question as of this moment.
Great. Well, I'm going to respect everyone's time and appreciate you for letting us go.
Caleb, I have one thing that I see in the chat that the department needs to address. This comment says it's concerning ATL zoning 2.0 is not willing to meet with neighborhoods via NPU meetings. Being told to email questions isn't practically helpful for engagement. At the beginning of this process, when the department started the Idea Labs, very transparently, the department said that it would not be meeting individually with individual neighborhoods or NPUs because we wanted the process to be extremely transparent, that everyone heard the same information at the same time. We have stuck to that, meaning we've had Idea Labs that were open to everyone in the city. We've had focused workshops that were open to everyone in the city. And we're having these modules and Q&As that are open to everyone in the city at the same time. So everyone hears the information at the same time. The department is not trying to be evasive and not meet with NPUs. But the department wants to make sure that everyone is receiving the information at the same time. Thank you, Caleb.
Thank you, Director Holmes. And I would like to mention, as a follow-up to that, we are also not meeting with developers or home builders or any special interest groups. You know, for better or worse, we want to make sure that any conversations are, as part of these meetings, they're submitted in writing so they become part of the public record as appropriate. We do not want any accusations that this zoning ordinance, which is really our consulting team's document to give to the city, does not represent a sort of above the board effort. And so we're not having any one-on-one meetings with developers or NPUs or anyone. We really want to make sure they're all in a public forum. So thank you. All righty. So with that said, I want to go very quickly through next steps. Again, we are not done here. You will be able to review this material on the project website in a couple of days. www.atlzoning.com. There is a project hotline. It is not staffed, but if you want to leave a message there, it will be transcribed and shared with us. I would like to say, if you have questions, please email them directly to atlzoning2@atlantaga.gov. As several residents have pointed out, we are having a problem getting the submissions through the project website. So I would ask everyone to please go into their email and use this until we have that figured out. There may be a delay. This meeting will be posted on YouTube in a couple of days. And of course, we have Conveo available where you can go and review everything. And I get a report every day of the comments, and between Christy, Director Holmes, and myself, we do try to answer everything there in a timely manner. So again, I would like to thank everyone so much for giving us the opportunity to present, and we look forward to future conversations with you. Thanks.